That's true. Naked Palpatine.
Oh, you pick that one. Fresh out of the clone tank, nude Palpatine is my
Well, that's the first thing I think of when you say Dark Empire Palpatine.
Hello everybody. Been a good long while since I last discussed Elric of Mount Nebeday. But today we have a story that released when I was born in 2001, which is a long time ago now. It is called The DreamThiefs' Daughter, and you can find this in the third collection of the Elric compendium. It is a strange placement of this story because it must, at least in Elric's perspective, take place before the last couple stories of his, because he dies at the end of his final story, and he's not dead in this story. But then also the first half of this story isn't even an Elric story. We are focused on Ulrich von Beck, who is an ancestor, is a descendant of another eternal champion who has his own stories. So this is a whole other thing with Michael Moorcock that you have to realize if you want to get into the thick of the universe. And even then, I just kind of freeballed it with a lot of Elric stories, but you have other characters that pop up in Elric stories that are supposedly also eternal champions, who are basically the MC, the main characters in their respective universes, but all essentially the same person. So, we got into the Spider-Verse a few years back, and Across the Spider-Verse, we're still waiting on that trilogy to end. But, you'd have different Spider-Mans. Like Spider-Man 2099 is not Peter Parker. He is Miguel O'Hara. But he is an actual Spider-Man. But he's a different person. But he basically serves the same function, just in the future. Sort of the same way that Terry McGinnis in Batman is Batman. He's just the Batman of the future. So it's kind of like that, except it's a different universe, right? So all these people are technically Elric, but they're not Elric. They're their own person. They may have their own different backstories, but they're all the person that is going to save their particular universe. And sometimes, like in the Elric stories, they, for a time, join up together because the threat gets so big that they must meet their counterparts and join forces to defeat. And we saw that many times in Elric stories. But I never really knew anything about them. Maybe you'd care more if you'd read those other Michael Moorcock stories to fully appreciate all that. That being said, so we're following a descendant of one of those guys in Nazi Germany, of all things. Yeah, this takes place during Nazi Germany. Wild, right? For an Elric story. Because Michael Moorcock basically wanted to make like all of his works basically somehow be connected. And so he wrote some contemporary things, or just kind of like, just like normal life. And he's like, well, I can connect it. I can connect the real life stuff to the fake fantasy stuff by putting Elric and all this crazy shite into Nazi Germany times, and using the tried and true platitude of what several games have used as reference points. There's an old Wolfenstein game just called Wolfenstein that you can't even play anymore. Like, you can't, unless you have an original Xbox 360 copy, which I don't anymore, but I remember playing the game back in the day. There's no PC port for it or anything, but you can find it. I think it was like 2009 or something. Wolfenstein. You can probably find it for expensive now, but it's a whole. And Indiana Jones does it too. The whole thing of the Nazis looking for these, spiritual artifacts, these whatever. So the occult portion of the Nazis, and so in the same way, that's kind of how it ties into the Elric stuff here. But like for 80 to 100 pages, you're just dealing with Nazi Germany and Ulrich being put in a nicer camp. because he's German. um, and a lot of moral posturing from Michael Moorcock bleeds through here, which I agree. I'm just saying it's like very blatantly Michael Moorcock talking, whether it be about the Nazi stuff or capitalism or whatever else. It's being discussed here. So that's kind of cool. What I will say, I think this story drags on a little bit more than it necessarily needed to, if I'm being frank. That being said, and this may be an extremely hot take among Elric fans, but this is probably one of my favorite Elric stories. Like, I was pretty much engaged the whole time. I think the writing was pretty good. Like, the dialogue was a significant step up from a lot of other stories, and I don't know, it just keeps moving. I mean, there is some pacing issues. I do think a little bit of this could have been cut. That wasn't necessary, but by and large, I had a good time with it. So it's a solid approval from me. The problem with these Michael Moorcock stories is the same problem that Conan has or any of these other characters have, and it's like, I get it. Respect your grandfather. Without these stories, or like some of the classic space opera as well. Like, without these stories, you couldn't have Star Wars, or you couldn't have Karsa Orlong from Malazan, or you couldn't have, controversially, The Witcher, or this or that, or yada 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 yada. Lord of the Rings, I think, still holds up. I haven't reviewed it because what can I say that's new? But then again, I reviewed Hamlet, so I could probably review Lord of the Rings just fine. Probably will at some point. Actually, at the time of this, it's January that I'm recording this, and I didn't do much for my birthday. I'm 25 now, I know, but I just worked. So my gift to myself was going to see the re-releases of the extended editions in theaters. So that was my gift to myself. A little tidbit, a little timeline scale for you as you watch this in July and go, oh, you made this video all the way back in January. Yes, there's your timeline there. If you're trying to track how I do my aheads. Anyway, all that to say, Elric doesn't really grow or have real character progression. There's a little bit in there, but it's like I'm reading all these stories and like, how am I supposed to be emotionally invested? You're just supposed to have fun with them, I suppose. But it's the same thing with Conan or this or that. Like, they just don't evolve or change. They just go on adventure after adventure, and it gets old after a while. Especially when the same concepts of these characters and stories and events have been done, yes, copied a little bit verbatim in other stories, but actually provided nuance, complexity, and engagement in those stories, which built upon these. And I understand these all came first, but then again, this doesn't have the excuse because this is 2001. At this point, The Witcher had already come up with their stuff, and at this point, also, it's 2001. We're already getting Steven Eriksen's books. I actually think right now, if it's 2001 when this book came out, then the same year, I think we would have gotten Dead House Gates by Steven Eriksen. And like, the bar in quality is just like this 2001 book that I'm reviewing feels like a book from like the 70s, whereas that book, didn't even necessarily feel 2001, but it transcends everything. Just like Lord of the Rings may have been written way back when, but it still reverberates to this very day. That's how you know you have a transcendent and lasting work. I understand Elric is like, people love him to this day. I'm just saying, like, for instance, and I don't think it's a huge spoiler to say, but in this story, we learn that Elric has a daughter, which he also learns too. But again, because Moorcock decided to write this retroactively, Elric never ever mentions his daughter in any other story. And he doesn't seem to forget that aspect, because usually when you meet like another version of yourself, right, they tend to forget you. It's like such a big like moment in messing with the time that in every other time that Elric has had to join forces with other versions of himself in his own stories, you will forget by the end of the story that happened. You'll remember like a version of events, but not with them, just so he can keep his mind sane. This is the one time where that explicitly they say it doesn't happen. He retains his memories of this event, which means he should remember his daughter, which never gets brought up. Maybe they'll be addressed in the next 2 stories in this collection. I don't know. But as for this one, it just kind of makes a contradiction that needlessly there. They also don't do much with Elric's daughter. I mean, she helps them like kind of get to places and does a couple things, but by and large, for such a big revelation, they don't do jack with it. So this is also after Witcher. So if anything, now it is Elric stealing from The Witcher, because all those stories already existed now. So it's like, you know, but by and large, I had fun with it, like a lot of fun. Like I think the writing was a step up. I thought a lot of the dialogue was a lot better, and I just by and large just had a really good time with it. So I would actually recommend this. I think it's a lot of fun. I have some things to discuss. Let's see. I got 2 notes from my phone. We got, for in the end, existentialist that I am, entropy alone is the only enemy worth challenging, and to conquer entropy is to reach a compromise with death. Always the ultimate victor in our conflicts. This is now spoiler section. I don't think I'm going to spoil you on too much, but in case you don't want any, there's the door. Forgot to say so. This particular weapon, which we called Ravenbrand, was a big long sword of black iron with a slender, unusual leaf-shaped blade. Our family legend said that it was forged by Friar Corvo, the Venetian armorer who wrote the famous treatise on the subject, but there is a tale that Corvo, the ravensmith, as Browning called him, only found the sword, or at least the blade itself, and wrought nothing but the hilt. Some said it was Satan's own blade, others said it was the devil himself. The Browning poem describes how Corvo gave his soul to bring the sword to life again. One day I would go with our Ravenbrand to Venice and discover for myself what truth there might be to the story. Volnesh went off and never came back. He was searching for a certain kind of metal, which he thought might be found on the Isle of Morn. So I just think it's cool, Ravenbrand, Stormbringer. Again, 2 different universes, but same sort of function of these swords. Like I said, it's the Nazi time period, so that's interesting. So we have this next quote. I think this might want to be one of my last ones. You don't believe in men of destiny, then, Erel? On the contrary, I believe that every so often the world creates a monster which represents either its very best or its very worst desires. Every so often the monster goes out of control and is left to certain of us, who call ourselves by various names, to fight that monster and to show that it can be wounded, if not destroyed. Not all of us use guns or swords. We'll use words in the ballot box, but sometimes the result is the same, for it is the motive in the end which the public must examine in its leaders. Given time, that is exactly what a mature democracy does. When it is frightened and bullied into bigotry, it no longer behaves like a mature democracy. And that is when the Hitlers move in. The public soon begins to see how little his actions and words suit their interests, and his vote is dwindling by the time he makes his final lunge for power. And though, luck and cunning, suddenly he finds himself in charge of a great, civilized nation which has failed once to understand the real brutality of war and desire never to know that reality again. I believe that Hitler represents the demonic aggression of a nation drowning in its own orthodoxies. Again, very clearly, letting his heart on his sleeve, Michael Moorcock is, but it was written very well, so I wanted to make sure to keep that written down there. We also have this huge moment. So there's this weird moment where like the minds of Elric and Ulric kind of combine for an instant. It's weird because it's still like Ulric's body, but Elric is controlling basically, and we get this epic, like Wolfenstein Doom style Nazi slaying scene. That was a lot of fun. And then we meet the mysterious lady Una, who I would later find out is in part Elric's daughter. Which also, apparently Elric, I don't even remember this, boned down with a girl back in the Pearl story, the Fortress of the Pearl, which again was already a retroactive story, I think, that was written in the 90s, pushed back to an earlier story. So we have a retro story that was shoved into the back of the timeline, being used as the centerpiece for this having a daughter as another thing. So that was a little much. I don't know, we've probably had these mentioned before, I don't know, but we have the moonbeam roads, which connect realities. I always imagine like kind of like the Rainbow Road in the Thor movies. I have one more quote for us here today. Or two more, sorry. Count Manfred. Manfred, the family had always considered him an embarrassment. A liar on the scale of... I can't even say that word. Just not because it's a bad word, I can't pronounce it. A scapegrace and turncoat, a spy, a Jabberkin, a servant of foreign kings, an adventurer with woman. His name is never mentioned. Well, Lord Reynard seemed to think he was fair scholar of the French Enlightenment, by which he sets great store. Ununa's daughter, I hesitated in mine. She was laughing openly now as she came towards me. I think it likely, don't you? I did not know there was issue. Oh, quite spectacular issue, I assure you, father. The word struck at me with the force of a tidal wave. Father. An emotional blow worse than any sword stroke. I wanted to deny it, to say anything which would prove me to be dreaming, to make this fact disappear, but my eyes could not deceive me. Everything about her showed that she was my daughter, and Una's. And I had loved Una briefly. We had sought the fortress of the Pearl together. And again, that's another thing that's a little weird about the story. Another negative, I'll say, is it goes from third person, like how you typically expect in fantasy a lot of the time, and it'll just randomly switch to Elric in first person, but then later on they won't make Elric being first person. It'll be in third person again, and it just kind of happens sporadically, and it's a little confusing. I don't know why he did that. I don't know why he did that. Basically, Ulrich's cousin is a Nazi and wants the Bravenbrand sword and Stormbringer so he can help the Reich. And he wants to take down Hitler and be Hitler, basically, whole thing. And so he travels between the fantasy realm and the real world to do this. And so, Elric and his other self, or descendant of his other self, Ulrich must work together to stop him, and eventually they do, and everything's hunky-dory and fine. There is this whole thing where Ariok, who, Elric prays to, who's some sort of demon, drops Elric and works for that guy because he offers him a bunch of stuff, but then when he can't deliver, he gets killed and tortured. And it's a whole bunch of crazy Elric shenanigans, as you come to expect by now with Elric stories. But the difference is I think this is the most comprehensible one out of all of them. This is if you think Nazis and fantasy characters and dragons killing Nazis is crazy, that's the least crazy thing that's happened in the series. Like that by comparison to everything else I've read, honestly seems very tame and mundane by comparison. But I guess you can also label this as portal fantasy, which is interesting. But like I said, this is definitely a way to just kind of make all the works that have nothing to do with this fantasy stuff still connect, because since the fantasy interacted with the mundane, with the Nazis, you can now assert that any story that Michael Moorcock writes exists within that sort of framework. So that is kind of cool. But like I said, fun, wacky, weird. It was a good time though, and I do recommend it, especially if you're a fan of Elric. Though, like I said, the first 100 pages of the story doesn't even include Elric. But I had fun with it, and I think you will too. Until next time, I have 2 more stories, and then I've read all of Elric, minus there's like a Lost Tales collection or whatever, and then I'll eventually get to the comics. But that's it for now. Till next time, live long and prosper, because I don't got any great quotes from Elric. None that I like enough anyway, so till then.